starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to Seabridge Global Logistics webinar on Australian Free Trade Agreements in today's business. Thanks for joining us. Today we're going to cover the basics of Australia's free trade agreements, both existing and those presently processing, and discuss not only the specific benefits of some of these agreements but also the requirements and or limitations in trade. We believe that furthering your practical knowledge in this area and understanding on how free trade agreements are placed into force can provide benefits to your business dealings and negotiations with overseas suppliers and clients and advance commercial gains through international trade. This webinar today will run for approximately 45 minutes in total, allowing for questions after our presentation. And on that note, you will see a field on your screen where you can communicate with us, and I believe someone already has sent a question through. So please feel free to, if a question pops into your mind at any time, to just send it through and it can be answered at the end. Our presenters today are Timothy Rice, National Customs Manager at Seabridge Global Logistics. And he'll be discussing or giving us a brief overview of what free trade agreements are available to us and what they are specifically. And Susan Danks of Susan Danks Tariff Consulting, a close partner of Seabridge and a CBFCO Fellow. She will be discussing further with us how the free trade agreements work and the specific requirements surrounding them. Together they bring over 50 years of experience in this space, and I would now like to hand over to you both.
Thank you, Nathan. Okay, well, let's start in discussing what are free trade agreements. A free trade agreement is an international treaty which removes barriers to trade and facilitates stronger trade and commercial ties between participating countries, contributing to increased economic integration between them. Free trade agreements are also known as regional trade agreements or preferential trade agreements, which is important to note as these are terminologies that are used by other countries. Free trade agreements are plurilateral, meaning they cover entire regions with multiple participants. Example of that is an Australia, New Zealand and Asian country free trade agreement, or they're bilateral, meaning just between two countries. An example is the Australian-US free trade agreement. Free trade agreements open up opportunities for Australian exporters and investors to expand their business into key overseas markets by improving market access for goods, services and investment. Australian consumers benefit through access to increased range of better value goods and services. Free trade agreements are not just to be confused with World Trade Organization multilateral negotiations, which are currently called the Doha Round. The idea with the WTO is that everybody gets together to do a deal, but like all deals, not everyone can agree. Therefore, free trade agreements are explicitly allowed for under the World Trade Organization rules. To be used between countries where WTO benchmarks are not enough. They must be WTO plus, however, which means they must be better than current round of WTO trade liberalisation. So for each free trade agreement that's entered into should give the parties an advantage over and above what is currently available under the current WTO multilateral trading agreements. Under World Trade Organization rules, free trade agreements must eliminate tariffs and other restrictions on substantially all the trade in goods between its member countries and eliminate substantially all discrimination against service suppliers from member countries, helping to increase trade in services. A free trade agreement often contains most favoured nation status for contracting parties. In general, most favoured nation means that every time a country lowers a trade barrier, it opens up a market. It has to do so for some goods excuse me, or services from all its trading partners, whether rich or poor, weak or strong. They also contain immediate commitments, example, immediate reduction in duty, and they also have commitments in phase-in over time. An example is incremental percentage drop in duty over a period of time. Commitments to work together through committees to strike new commitments where parties agree to hold meetings and try to advance the cause of various aspects of the FTA. ACI-FTA states that Australian Free Trade Agreement negotiations are increasingly focused on so-called behind-the-border issues. A range of factors such as standards, professional qualifications, intellectual property rights and competition policies in trade in partner countries that may impact heavily on Australian companies exporting to those markets. Such barriers are often more of a problem for business than border measures such as tariffs and quota restrictions, which have been a focus to trade negotiations traditionally, but which have become relatively less important over time as the average tariff levels have fallen. The benefits of free trade agreements. The Australian government's free trade agreement policy aims primarily at maximising the economic benefits flowing to Australia from the negotiation of these agreements. Free trade agreements foster free trade flows, create stronger ties with our trading partners. Free trade agreements don't just eliminate tariffs, they also address behind-border barrier issues that impede the flow of goods and services between parties. They encourage investment, enhance cooperation, and can address other issues such as intellectual property, e-commerce, and government procurement. FTAs can increase Australia's productivity and contribute to higher GDP growth by allowing domestic business access to cheaper inputs, introducing new technologies and fostering competition and innovation. Free trade agreements promote regional economic integration and build shared approaches to trade and investment, including through the adoption of common rules of origin and through border acceptance of product standards. FTAs can enhance the competitiveness of Australian exports in partner markets and add to the attractiveness of Australia as an investment destination. They can deliver enhanced trading opportunities that contribute to sustainable economic growth of less developed economies, and they can continue to provide benefits to parties as the agreements are implemented, including through phase-ins and inbuilt agendas that encourage ongoing domestic reform and trade liberalisation. DFAT have given us top 10 ways FTAs are used. So basically, increasing goods exports to a market through increase in competitiveness of products into FTA partner country markets compared to competitors from countries not under an FTA. Commencing new goods exports to a market, lowering tariffs can be a good incentive for Australian businesses to consider exporting to a new market. Achieving efficiencies through cheaper imported inputs. FTAs may improve access to cheaper, better quality and more technologically advanced imported inputs to business. Harness a new and more secure access to service markets. FTAs may provide new outcomes, liberalising market access and reducing regulatory barriers in different service sectors. Deepening engagement in global value chains, where an incentive is created under an FTA, may help business secure contracts to supply a production input. Investigating and with enhanced protections and certainty. FTAs include provisions to improve market access, ensuring non-discrimination, and guarantee protection and security for investments. Number 7 is travelling for business more easily through visas. And number 8, accessing government procurement markets. Addressing behind-the-border barriers to trade. For example, FTAs ensure Australian innovators and creative industries enjoy high levels of intellectual property protections in partner economies. And a very important one is contributing to trade negotiation business consultations. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade consults widely and regularly before and during negotiations and when there are reviews. Businesses which make timely submissions on their priority trade and investment issues in FTA negotiations stand the best chance to have an issue addressed in the outcome. This could be through written submissions, practical participation in public consultations, or work through a peak body. Once an FTA enters into force, business consultation often remains an ongoing feature of the agreement, with regular meetings and reviews often taking place under the inbuilt agenda set out in an agreement. Such consultations allow business to inform government of any problems that may arise with the implementation of the FTA and provides an opportunity for government to give updates on progress of any inbuilt agendas. So with Seabridge, we can assist you with those submissions and giving you guidance in regards to that. Current free trade agreements. Australia currently has 9 enforced free trade agreements. They're with Australia and New Zealand Closer Economic Relations Trade Agreement. We have one with Singapore, United States, Canada, Chile, Malaysia, the ASEAN Australia New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, which covers Australia, New Zealand, Brunei, Myanmar, which is Burma, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia and Indonesia. So that's a plurilateral agreement. So with some of those nations we do have bilateral agreements. So Thailand, we have a bilateral agreement, as well as Korea and Japan. Currently concluded FTAs. Australia's free trade agreement with China is the only current concluded but not yet entered into force agreement. Australia concluded free trade agreement negotiations with China in November 2014. The agreement will be in force when domestic processes have been completed, which we believe hopefully by the end of this year. The latest news on the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement from the Trade Minister Andrew Robb is that China has agreed to the most favoured nation provisions within the agreement, meaning that Australia will automatically receive the same treatment provided by China to any other country in the future, including the EU and the United States, ensuring that future benefits conferred to other countries will flow automatically to Australia. Continuing FTA negotiations, Australia currently has engaged in 6 other FTA negotiations with the Gulf Cooperation Council, with India, with the Pacific Agreement on Closer Economic Relationships Plus, with Indonesia, which is a bilateral agreement which hopefully will extend the coverage of the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement we currently have with Indonesia. The Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which is one this is coming up quite a bit at the moment. It's basically held up a little bit by the US, but it looks like these things will be going to be sorted out very shortly. So this one that you will be hearing a lot more of. And the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which basically covers ASEAN member states and those countries which have existing FTAs with ASEAN, being Australia, China, India, Japan, Republic of Korea and New Zealand. So I hope that gives you an idea of what an FTA is and the benefits and what countries conclude that we have concluded with and currently in negotiation with. I'm going to pass over to Sue, who will take you through how FTAs work and the requirements that are needed to be met with regards to free trade agreements.
Thank you, Tim. So the the area in which I'll talk about FTAs is in how they work. It's to give you a better understanding of the requirements that are necessary for importation of the goods into Australia. The 2 main ones that you'll hear about are certificates of origin and the consignment rule, but there are some other rules that we'll discuss very briefly in more detail towards the end of the session. Certificates of origin, depending on the free trade agreement, are available from either nominated authorities or in some instances other bodies can be issued them. They're different from certificates of origin that we normally see from a Chamber of Commerce in that they generally also refer to the rule of origin that they meet. Because we do have so many free trade agreements, you can pick and choose between the free trade agreement that you wish to use. Australia's 10 major trading partners include 8 of the countries with which we've currently got FTAs. The only two that are not included are Germany and the UK. In looking at the FTAs and in looking which one we'll use, it is occasionally more beneficial to choose one over the other. For example, Australia has a free trade agreement with New Zealand, a bilateral agreement, as Tim has explained. We also have a trading agreement with New Zealand through the ASEAN trade agreement. If you had to choose which one you were using, in most instances, you would probably use the bilateral agreement. And the reason for that is that there is no specific certificate of origin format required. Yes, the importer, as with all our free trade agreements and with all imports, does need to provide and hold evidence that the FTA applies, but it is certainly much easier not to have to get the certificate of origin overseas from a nominated body with a nominated signatory, which is the requirement under ANSFTA, the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. Similarly, under some free trade agreements, the duty rate that applies may actually vary to particular goods between free trade agreements. There are other benefits, and they all relate to the rule of origin. When we talk about rules of origin, or when we talk about the free trade agreements, generally they all refer to originating and non-originating goods. Originating goods are the produce of a particular country. So think apples grown in a country, steel manufactured from iron ore that has been mined in that country. They are originating goods, and that requirement is common across all our free trade agreements. They'd still need a certificate if a certificate is required for that FTA, but they are going to get it. If the goods, however, are non-originating, then they must meet the rule of origin that applies to those goods. And that rule of origin is found by reference to the tariff classification. It is therefore critical that the tariff classification of your goods is correct, because if you've got the tariff classification wrong, then you also have the possibility of getting the rule of origin wrong. And if it's wrong and the FTA doesn't apply and you are audited by customs, you could incur penalties. It's therefore very wise to ensure that your customs broker is fully conversant with all the requirements and competent in classification of the goods. So wholly obtained goods, as I've said, is something like apples. And this basic rule of origin is common to all goods. You just need the statement that it's an originating good, and therefore it complies, therefore it gets the free trade agreement. The rules of origin are divided generally into three types: change of tariff classification, regional value content, and some specific rules relating to chemicals, plastics, rubber in general. The change of tariff classification is the most common rule of origin, and it can require the change of tariff classification in three different areas. It can require it by chapter, or at the heading level, or at the subheading level. Now that may not mean too much to you, but to put it in a practical example, by chapter, if you have steel bars are in chapter 72 of the tariff. If you turn it into a machine, then that machine may be classified in chapter 84. That's the two digits. That meets that. By heading level means that the goods are 4 digits, so that you may use a valve as an example of heading 8481 to manufacture a filter of heading 8413. That would comply. At subheading level, if it's required, it can get difficult. And this is because in the customs tariff, those last couple of digits are often relating to parts. It's therefore critical in looking at any change of tariff classification, again, that you classify the goods correctly, and that you ensure that the rule of origin and any change of classification required is at the correct level. And this is particularly the case where the certificate of origin is not from a nominated authority. If it's from a nominated authority, as is required under ASEAN or the Singapore Free Trade Agreement, then they're going to look at that. With other certificates of origin, that may not be the case. Regional value content is something that we see a lot of, and as another rule of origin. Sometimes it is combined with change of tariff classification, sometimes it is not. Essentially, it is a calculation of the factory or works cost of the good to reach a specified threshold. And that calculation is allowed under all our free trade agreements to be done either up towards what's essentially the factory cost, or down from the sale price to get back to the factory cost. The formula for each is specified in each free trade agreement. It can be an additional requirement to change your tariff classification. As I said, that's common with textiles, or it can be by itself. In the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, there is a rule that we used to call the general rule that said even if the goods didn't meet any change of tariff classification rule of origin, if they were at least 45% regional value content, then they still pick up the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. Some of our free trade agreements and interpreting the rules can be quite complex, and we're here to assist if we can help. Other rules. It's probably self-evident that if you're manufacturing in the country, the final process of manufacture needs to take place there. There used to be a very famous case when we talked tariff classification that we used to talk about, that was a stuffed koala toy. So in one country they made the skin, and another one they stuffed it. In the second one they stuffed it. The origin, the final process of manufacture, is when they turn that toy into the toy. So the final process of manufacture must take place in that country. The only time you may see any variation is under the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, and the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement talks about the process of accumulation. Accumulation, it simply means that the process of manufacture and all the components can come from any member of the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. What the process is that you get back-to-back certificates of origin, and when it gets to the final country, that issuing authority issues the final certificate of origin. The other thing that you should be aware of is the de minimis rule, because sometimes not every single component or ingredient meets the rule of origin. Our free trade agreements, all of them so far, all contain a de minimis rule that say that if that component or that ingredient is less than 10% of the value, or in the case of textiles 10% of the weight, then you can still claim the free trade agreement. The specific provisions are in each free trade agreement. The consignment rule is something that confuses a lot of people. It requires what we as customs brokers call direct shipment, but that doesn't mean that you can't tranship the goods. The consignment rule has got provisions that are specific to each free trade agreement as to whether you're allowed to import the goods or transit the goods or process certain minimal procedures on the goods before or in other countries on their way to Australia. With our earlier free trade agreements, it's common, for example, in the US Free Trade Agreement, and I think Tim made reference to it, that US companies have Asian hubs. They still own the goods, they just store them in a warehouse so that they can distribute them. Under ACI-FTA, this is allowed, but under the Japan Economic Partnership Agreement and under the Korean Free Trade Agreement, and probably under CAFTA, the Chinese agreement, when it is eventually ratified, this will not be allowed. You'll be able to tranship, but you won't be able to enter it into any other country. You therefore need to be very careful, again, that you meet the specific provisions of the consignment rule. One of the benefits of our free trade agreements that often is not appreciated is that where you're not talking about a regional value content, where you're just talking about a simple change in tariff classification, and as I've said, that is the majority of rules of origin. Accessories, spare parts, tools and instructional or other information materials that are imported in the same consignment as the goods and that are in the normal quantities for those goods and generally supplied with those goods are eligible for the provisions of the free trade agreement, providing that the principal good is. The only time that you would need to look at them separately would be if there was a regional value content. So where you've got accessories, where you've got spare parts, where you've got tools, in summary, if the goods get the free trade agreement, they do, and they do not need to show evidence of it. It's all on the primary goods. A similar provision exists for packaging, and when we talk packaging, we're talking retail packaging. If the goods that it contains get the free trade agreement, then the packing gets the free trade agreement, and you do not need to go through and check that it meets any particular rule of origin. It comes back to the prime good again. The only exception to that would be where the goods are subject to a regional value content. And when that occurs, then the value of the packing does need to be included in the calculations. So thank you very much. It's a very brief rundown of the free trade agreements and the provisions behind them. We'd welcome any questions you have, and certainly we would welcome your contact if we can assist you further. Questions, I'll hand over to Nathan.
Thanks, Susan. Well, I hope that was received clearly and is slowly sinking in. I'd now like to open the webinar for questions, so please send them through. Whilst we're waiting for them to come through, I might get us started. A simple question, but one that often comes up that I'd like you to discuss is, are free trade agreements always free? Susan.
Thanks, Nathan. That's an interesting one, because I had a complaint from a client only last week in regard to it, that he was very excited that Korean free trade agreement had kicked in and all of their product comes from Korea and it's all the same good, and lo and behold, they're still paying duty. And his comment was, we've got a free trade agreement, why am I paying duty? The reason he was paying duty is because of what's called phasing rates. Now, these particular goods, as you know, the free trade agreement, Korean free trade agreement only kicked in a few months ago. This year, pay 3%. Next year, they'll pay 2%. The year after that, they'll pay 1%. And then in, 3-4 years' time, they'll be duty-free. Until that time, they'll receive a concessional rate of duty, that is a lower rate of duty, but they won't be duty-free. So in looking at that, you then need to start to consider, and it was an issue for this client, whether he should also be looking at tariff concessions, because he paid enough money still at 3% that it wasn't worthwhile just depending on the FTA for now.
Thanks, Susan. Another common question, I think one that's high in mind at the moment, especially in the media, is CAFTA, the China Free Trade Agreement. We know that it's all signed off, but when do we believe this may come into force and be concluded on its finalisation processes with government?
CAFTA basically is being ratified. The general rule of thumb, these things is they can take sort of 9 to 12 months to become ratified. As you can understand, basically it's got to go through each country's government departments, and then they have to be translated, and I think that's where the majority of the time spent in regards to making sure that translation to both sides is correct, so there's no misunderstanding in regards to the agreements that will be signed off at the end of it. So we are looking at this particular time at the end of this year, and we'll definitely be keeping people up to date with what's happening with the CHAFTA agreement, and basically and giving people a heads up when it does become ratified and what it's going to involve and take to be something that they could claim.
Great. Another question. Do the free trade agreements in their territories make the certificates of origin obsolete? I might pass this one to you, Susan.
Thanks, Nathan. The certificates of origin that are required for the FTAs are specific to the FTAs that we have. They may not always be the certificate of origin that is required under your contract. They may not be the certificate of origin that is required to get preferential duty rates, which are different than the FTA duty rates. While we talk about preference and origin, all of our free trade agreements, where they specify the requirement for a certificate of origin from a nominated body, it has to be in a specific form. Generally, it also has to say and contain specific information, and that information is generally which rule of origin it meets, and that could be something like 100%. You know, it's an apple out of New Zealand, grown in New Zealand. It could also be 50%, as in 50% of the regional value content was in an ASEAN country, and that would get the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. But sometimes when you're doing a project, the company requires just a certificate of origin, and that sort of thing you tend to get through bodies such as Chambers of Commerce or other bodies that can issue them. Some of our free trade agreements do not specify that certificates of origin have to be from a nominated body, but they do need to. The importer does, however, need to be able to show that they hold information that allows them to claim that free trade agreement. And so in some instances, certificates of origin by other bodies can be issued that would meet that requirement.
Great, thank you very much. We don't have any more questions for now. So I'd just like to thank you both, Tim and Susan. Your time and advice is much appreciated. This afternoon, if you're registered to listen to this webinar, you'll receive a copy of this webinar recording and presentation slides as well. I guess the information that we've covered today, the topic itself comes with quite a lot of depth, which we're not able to go through within half an hour or so. So on that, if you would like any further information or would like to receive advice, please feel free to send us an email. You've got the email address there at customers@seabridge.com.au, or give us a call, and we'll certainly love to assist you further. I mean, these free trade agreements, for example, even the China one that isn't into force as yet, CHAFTA, I mean, they may not come into force for some time, but it's important to begin working on it now, as the processes, as you heard, can be quite complex. And lastly, I'd just like to thank you for listening and joining us today. Thank you.